Good evening. I'm about to do something that I've never done before, and that's post something to YouTube, which is in direct response to someone called the Officer Tatum's video on YouTube in reference to the Ahmaud Arbery shooting. First and foremost, my name is Mark Watkins, and I am a licensed attorney in the state of Georgia. Tatum goes on to say, he begins his video by stating that he is an ex police officer. Well, I don't know what his training is as far as being an officer. I don't know if he's a licensed attorney at this point. I, however, am. I'm also licensed in Georgia. I'm a former prosecutor and current defense attorney. So, dealing with criminal laws is something that I do on a daily basis. I can't say that Tatum is falls under that category, whether or not he is up on Georgia law specifically or what type of knowledge he has. So I'm making this video to contradict pretty much everything that he says and the conclusions that he comes to. First and foremost, Tatum says that he's not here to discuss right or wrong. He's not here to pick sides or anything of that nature. However, he pretty much does exactly that. First off, let's back up and state that, again, he is a former officer. He does not know law the way that lawyers do, despite what he may have done on the streets. I don't know what streets he was an officer. I don't know what city, state, or jurisdiction that he was in. In discussing Mr. Arbery, he begins with discussing what Mr. Arbery first did, and that is enter into a dwelling. Mr. Arbery and people like Candace Owens, people like Tommy Lauren, want to use that aspect as a reason for Mr. Arbery losing his life. That does not give justification for the incidents that happened that caused Mr. Arbery to be murdered in the streets. Okay? First and foremost, Mr. Arbery entered onto the property of another individual. There's no dispute that that house, that structure was not his. It's my understanding that the McMichaels saw him there, may have come out, and basically chased him off, for lack of a better term. Okay? At that point, what the McMichaels did, their duty was complete. If they saw something that they found was suspicious in their neighborhood, there's absolutely nothing wrong whatsoever with trying to prevent possibly a crime occurring or trying to figure out what was going on. What you do at that point, what any citizen would do at that point, is call law enforcement, give a description of what they saw, who they saw, where they were, and leave it up to the professionals to handle the situation. Both McMichaels are not professional law enforcement officers. I understand that the father may very well have been a police officer in his day, but on this particular day, in February 23rd, 2020, he was not acting as a law enforcement officer, but rather a vigilante. I also have read the police reports. According to Mr. Tatum, who said that he read the police reports, but I've read the police reports as well from that jurisdiction, from the officers who were on the scene that particular day. What they indicated is they loaded up with guns immediately. Okay? They didn't just call 911 and say, hey, we saw this suspicious individual in this house, go get him. They both went armed, got armed, and then went chasing after Mr. Arbery in the street. Okay? They were acting as vigilantes, they were civilians. Now, Tatum wants to go ahead and say, well, they had the right to do this to make a citizen's arrest when they saw a crime being committed. What crime was committed? Think about that for a second. What crime specifically occurred? They think they know what happened, and Mr. Tatum thinks he knows what happened. Mr. Tatum makes a lot of assumptions in his video. He says that Mr. Arbery went into the house to commit a felony, i.e., burglary. A burglary is basically a theft. Tatum doesn't know what Mr. Arbery's intent was. He may have had no criminal intention whatsoever. Okay? At worst, what Mr. Arbery did was criminal trespass, which is a misdemeanor in Georgia under the law. That is OCGA 16721, which is criminal trespass. In order to commit a criminal trespass in Georgia, you have to be in or on somebody's property in order to commit for an unlawful purpose, is what the statute says, for an unlawful purpose. Anytime somebody comes up to your door and they enter onto your property and knock on the door, they may be trying to sell you candles, maybe trying to sell you Girl Scout cookies. They may not be there for an unlawful person. So it is allowed for people to come onto your property so long as they don't have criminal intent. There is no idea, we have no idea what Mr. Arbery's intent was when he went into this structure. Okay? He could have been like many of us have done. I know I've done it plenty of times. I know many of you have done it plenty of times, be it a house under construction or something that's being worked on. We may have gone onto property with no criminal intent whatsoever, but merely out of curiosity to see what's going on. Mr. Tatum goes on to say, well, this was a house that's being renovated, and obviously he was there. He wasn't there to, see how his couch would fit in. He makes the assumption that Mr. Arbery was there to commit a crime. Well, we don't know that Mr. Arbery was there to commit a crime. As I said a moment ago, he could have been there mainly to be curious about what was going on. Okay? The video that Mr. Arbery posted seemed like it was from a Ring camera from one of the neighbors about Mr. McMichael coming out of the house and then Mr. Arbery taking off on his way. Okay? Once Mr. Arbery left and the McMichaels loaded up into their vehicles, they began to chase him. Okay? Once they caught up to to Mr. Arbery, at that point, when they get out of the vehicle with guns, Mr. Arbery, under Georgia law, has the right to defend himself. Okay? He has the right to use force to prevent force from being put upon him. I know that Tatum wants to say, well, the McMichaels were using self-defense when he shot Mr. Arbery dead. Okay? Well, under Georgia law, you cannot be the primary aggressor in a situation and then claim self-defense. I would argue that when you're chasing somebody down the street in two vehicles and going down one street or another looking for somebody, and this person is trying to get away from you, at that point, you are the primary aggressor. Understand, they were not police officers, they were not in police cruisers, they were not in any form of law enforcement gear, as in uniforms. At that point, from Mr. Arbery's standpoint, all you have is a couple of individuals in a truck chasing him down. He is under no legal obligation under Georgia or any law that I'm aware of to stop for civilians. Okay? Understand, that is very important. A lot of people want to make note of the fact that the McMichaels engaged Mr. Arbery, but he was not under any legal obligation to stop for these individuals. Okay? Now, once they engage Mr. Arbery, you see. Now, I'll freely admit that I have not watched the complete video. I will not watch yet another young black person murdered for my curiosity's sake or for entertainment. I just won't do it. But from everything that I've heard from people who actually have watched it, you hear or see that Mr. Arbery is doing his best to try to get away from the McMichaels. Once he was unable to do so, he then engaged Travis to try to get the weapon away from him. At that point, Mr. Arbery is the only one who had the legal right to assert self-defense. Why? Because he was being chased by civilians who were armed, from his standpoint, trying to do harm to him. At this point, when he was shot, he was murdered, based on what I have viewed as far as Georgia law is concerned. Mr. Tatum makes, as I said from the outset, Mr. Tatum makes a lot of assumptions. He makes the assumption of what Mr. Arbery was doing inside the house. He makes assumptions on what the end result will be once this makes it to a jury, and you just can't do that. I have tried more cases than I can remember. I've tried murder cases, and you never know what a jury will do. I will say that I feel that what Mr. Tatum has said, how he has said it, is somewhat irresponsible. Yes, he's got experience being a law enforcement officer. He does not have an experience trying cases, to my knowledge. If I'm wrong about that, then I will apologize. But from my knowledge, all he says is that he is an ex-cop, not a current law enforcement officer, but an ex-cop. At no point in time does he say that he is currently licensed to practice law anywhere, let alone here in Georgia. So I take umbrage with his analysis of this situation because, quite frankly, he's wrong in my opinion based on my training, based on my experience, based on my knowledge of how the law works here in Georgia based on my experience of what occurred on this particular day. A lot of people want to point to what happened immediately prior, and I understand that. Okay, that's what got the ball rolling. I get that. I understand that. But from what the McMichaels saw, at worst, the only thing that they saw was a misdemeanor criminal trespass. And quite frankly, under Georgia law, I don't even think that burden would be met. So nothing that they did trying to make a quote unquote citizen's arrest is valid. They have no legal authority, they have no legal standing, they have no legal ground to do what they did, in my opinion. So, with that said, thank you very much.